What do you do when your entire life is about tearing things down, but you find a life you can't bear to erase? The air in Flagstaff that morning was sharp enough to cut glass. 7,000 feet up, the cold had teeth. Jake Riley felt it in his bones, a familiar ache that signaled the end of the season. The growl of the diesel excavator was the only music he cared about. Its steel teeth tore into the dry, tired wood of the old ranger station, spitting out splinters and dust. Another day, another demolition. His foreman, Jake, watched with weathered eyes, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his brown Carhartt jacket. They were behind schedule. The frost was coming earlier this year, and the developer was getting nervous. He glanced at Leo Garcia, the youngest on his crew. Leo was leaning on a shovel, one earbud in, his thumb swiping across his phone screen. "Leo," Jake's voice was gravel. "You get paid to move dirt, not your thumb." Leo barely looked up. "Just checking the forecast, boss. Says we might get some powder." Jake snorted. "We get paid whether it snows or shines. Get back on the pile." He hated this part of the job, tearing down history. This old station, nestled against the Coconino National Forest, had probably stood for 80 years. Now it was just an obstacle between a developer and a row of luxury condos. His phone buzzed. It was his son, Mark. Jake let it go to voicemail. He knew the conversation. Mark, the environmental science major, the lectures about carbon footprints and habitat destruction. Jake didn't have the energy for it today. The excavator operator gave a sharp blast of the horn. He was pointing toward the building. The machine's arm had pulled back, revealing a dark, gaping hole in what was once an interior wall. The engine idled down, and a strange quiet fell over the site. "Before we continue, let us know from which city you are. We are interested to know from where our videos are watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This gives us motivation to make new and interesting videos." So, let's get started. Jake walked over, his heavy boots crunching on debris. "What is it, Al?" The operator pointed. "Something in there. Saw movement." Leo, his curiosity finally piqued, jogged over, phone already in hand, recording. "No way. Is it a raccoon? A snake?" Jake peered into the darkness. The air inside smelled of dust, rot, and something else. Something warm and alive. He squinted, letting his eyes adjust. And then he saw them. Tucked into a nest of shredded pink insulation and dry leaves were 4 tiny bundles of fur. They were spotted. No bigger than his fist, with ears still too big for their heads. Their cloudy, newborn blue eyes blinked slowly in the sudden light. Kittens. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of Jake's neck. It was the feeling of being watched. He slowly lifted his head, scanning the dense line of ponderosa pines that marked the edge of the property, maybe 100 yards away. He saw nothing at first, just shadows and tree trunks. Then, a flicker of movement, a patch of shadow that wasn't a shadow. It was a cat. Tawny fur, muscular shoulders, and short, tufted ears. Its yellow eyes were fixed directly on him. They weren't angry or scared. They were intelligent, calculating. It was the mother, a bobcat. She sat perfectly still, a silent, powerful judge watching the men who had just destroyed her home. Leo let out a low whistle. "Whoa, that's a bobcat. A full-grown bobcat?" He raised his phone higher. "This is going to be epic." Jake's hand shot out and pushed the phone down. "Put it away," he ordered, his voice low and firm. "Everybody back away. Now." The crew grumbled, but obeyed. They knew that tone. Jake pulled out his own phone, but not to record. His thumb hovered over the contact for his boss, David Henderson. This was a problem. A big, expensive, and potentially dangerous problem. He had to shut down the site. Shut it down? Riley, are you insane? David Henderson's voice was sharp and metallic over the phone, a stark contrast to the quiet tension on the site. Do you know what a one-day delay costs me? We're talking tens of thousands of dollars in equipment rental and labor, not to mention the penalty clauses in my financing. Jake watched the tree line. The bobcat hadn't moved. She was a statue carved from the forest itself. It's a bobcat, Mr. Henderson, with kittens. We broke into the den. Legally, I have to call Arizona Game and Fish. My hands are tied. There was a long, frustrated sigh on the other end of the line. Fine, call them. But I want this resolved, Riley. I'm giving you 48 hours, 2 days. If those animals are not gone by Thursday morning, I'm bringing in my own team to relocate them. Do you understand me? The word relocate hung in the air with a cold, final meaning. Jake understood perfectly. It meant a trap, a cage, and a problem disappearing one way or another. I understand, Jake said, his jaw tight. The call ended. The weight of the deadline settled on his shoulders. 48 hours. It felt like an impossibly short amount of time. The Game and Fish warden had been blunt. Best case scenario? The mother moves them on her own tonight. Worst case? She's too spooked and she abandons them. We can't go in there. If she feels cornered, she could get aggressive. Or she could panic and run, and those kittens would be a death sentence. Later that afternoon, another vehicle pulled up. Not a construction truck, but a mud-splattered Subaru. A woman in her late 30s stepped out, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She moved with a quiet confidence. This was Dr. Anya Sharma, a wildlife biologist the warden had recommended from a local coalition. She didn't approach the building. Instead, she took out a pair of binoculars and studied the tree line for a long time. Dr. Sharma lowered her binoculars, her expression thoughtful. She's in a classic behavioral trap, she explained, her voice calm and measured. Her instinct is to retrieve her kittens, but her survival instinct is screaming at her that this open, noisy space is a death trap. She won't cross it. Leo, growing impatient, chimed in. So, why don't we just, grab them? We could put them in a box by the trees. Problem solved. Dr. Sharma gave him a patient look. If she sees us handle her young, she'll likely reject them. Our scent, the trauma of the event. She would see them as tainted, compromised. She'd abandon them. She turned to Jake. The developer gave you a deadline? Jake nodded grimly. Thursday morning. Dr. Sharma's gaze drifted from Jake to the watchful eyes in the forest. Then we don't have time to wait for her to feel safe. We have to make her feel safe. She pointed toward a spot at the edge of the woods, about 50 yards from the demolished building. We're going to build her a new home, right there. A temporary den. Something small, sheltered, and appealing. We make it as inviting as possible. Then, we hope she understands. Jake stared at her. You want us to build a house for a bobcat? Essentially, she said without a trace of irony. It's our only shot, but she has to be the one to make the final move. That evening, Jake sat in his truck as the rest of the crew packed up. The sun was setting, painting the San Francisco peaks in shades of orange and purple. The temperature was already dropping. He called his son, Mark. He didn't know why. Maybe he wanted to tell someone who would understand the bizarre reality of his day. He explained the situation, the kittens, the mother, the deadline. Mark was quiet for a moment. Then he said, his voice laced with familiar cynicism, So you tear down half a forest for a condo complex? And now you're worried about one cat. A little late to play hero, don't you think, Dad? The words hit Jake harder than he expected. He ended the call, the silence in his truck feeling heavier than before. He was alone in this, caught between his son's judgment, his boss's ultimatum, and the unwavering silent stare of a wild animal. The next morning, the air was different. A damp chill had settled in, and the sky was a flat, uniform gray. A storm was coming. Leo had been right. The forecast now called for an early-season snowstorm, due to hit within 24 hours. Dr. Sharma arrived with the dawn, her face serious. "This changes everything," she said, looking at the bruised sky. "Those kittens are in an uninsulated wall. If that storm hits and they're still in there, they won't survive the night. The temperature drop will be too severe. Our 48-hour deadline just became a 24-hour one." The pressure was now suffocating. Under Dr. Sharma's direction, they began to work. Jake and a now subdued Leo gathered scrap plywood and 2x4s. They built a simple, 3-sided structure, no bigger than a large doghouse, with a low roof. "It needs to feel enclosed, secure," Dr. Sharma instructed. "Like a cave." While they worked, she did something strange. She took a sterile bag and, using long tongs, carefully collected handfuls of the old, shredded insulation and dusty leaves from the original nest. "Scent is everything," she explained. "We need the new den to smell like home, to smell like her." Throughout the entire process, the mother bobcat watched. She moved through the trees like a ghost, appearing in one spot, then vanishing and reappearing in another. She was tracking their every move, her golden eyes missing nothing. The construction of her new home was a performance for an audience of one. Leo was quiet as he worked, his usual wisecracks gone. He kept glancing at the tree line, then back at the small, helpless kittens huddled in the wall. Jake watched him. The kid was seeing it now, not as a problem or a video opportunity, but as a life-or-death drama playing out in real time. By midday, the makeshift den was complete. They placed it at the edge of the forest, tucked between 2 large boulders for extra cover. Dr. Sharma carefully arranged the old nesting material inside. It looked surprisingly inviting. "Okay," she said, stepping back. "Phase 1 is done. Now, we wait." But they didn't have time to wait. As the afternoon wore on, the wind picked up, whistling through the pines. The sky grew darker. Jake's phone rang. It was Henderson. "Riley, status report." His voice was devoid of any patience. "She hasn't moved them, Mr. Henderson. The biologist says it takes time." "Time is what I don't have. The weather report looks ugly. My investors are calling. This farce ends now. Be ready to clear the site at dawn. My team will be there at 6 a.m. sharp to deal with your animal problem. And if your crew gets in their way, you'll all be looking for new jobs." The call ended with a sharp click. This was it. The final ultimatum. They had until dawn. Jake looked at Dr. Sharma. She had heard the one-sided conversation, and her face was grim. "He's not bluffing, is he?" Jake shook his head. "No, he's not." "Then we have to change the plan," she said, her voice dropping. "She's not going to move them herself in time. The storm, the pressure, she's paralyzed. There's only one option left. It's the highest risk, but it's all we have." She looked from the den to the watchful mother, then to Jake. "Someone has to move the kittens. Someone she trusts." Leo scoffed. "Trusts? It's a wild animal. It doesn't trust any of us." "Not true," Dr. Sharma corrected quietly. "For the past day and a half, she's been watching. But she's been watching one person more than anyone else." Her eyes settled on Jake. You. You were the first to find them. You've been here the longest. You haven't made any aggressive moves. In her mind, you are the alpha of this bizarre, loud pack. If anyone has a chance of approaching that nest without her panicking, it's you. The weight of her words felt physical. The idea was insane. To deliberately walk toward the young of a predator, in plain sight of their mother, it went against every instinct. But as he looked at the darkening sky and felt the first icy drop of rain on his cheek, he knew she was right. It was the only way. The crew left as dusk began to bleed into the landscape. But Jake stayed. He pulled a 5-gallon bucket from his truck, set it down 50 yards from the tree line, and sat. He just sat there, in the cold, as the wind began to howl. He didn't look directly at the bobcat, but he could feel her gaze on him. It was a silent vigil, a strange, desperate negotiation between a man with calloused hands and a wild mother pushed to the absolute edge. He was making a promise in the only language he could. I am not a threat. Hours passed. The rain turned to sleet, and in the deep woods, the yellow eyes watched and waited. Dawn broke not with light, but with a pale, ghostly gray. The wind howled, and the sleet was turning to thick, wet snow. It was now or never. Henderson's team would be here in less than an hour. Dr. Sharma stood beside Jake, her face etched with tension. Leo was there too, his phone forgotten in his pocket. She's close, Dr. Sharma whispered, pointing. The bobcat wasn't deep in the woods anymore. She was at the very edge of the tree line, partially concealed behind a snow-dusted pine, no more than 40 yards from the new shelter they had built. Her focus was absolute. She knows something is about to happen, Dr. Sharma said. She's giving you as much trust as a wild animal can. Don't betray it. Slow movements, no sudden noises. Let her see your hands. Jake pulled on a pair of thick leather work gloves. His heart was hammering against his ribs. This was crazy. Every rational part of his brain was screaming at him to stop. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the icy air burning his lungs. He started walking. Each step was a gamble. He didn't walk toward the mother. He walked toward the hole in the wall, keeping his body angled so she could see him clearly. The snow crunched under his boots, the only sound besides the wind. He could feel her eyes on him, a physical pressure on his back. He reached the wall and knelt down. The 4 kittens were huddled together, shivering. They were so small, so fragile. He looked over his shoulder one last time. The bobcat was tense, her body low to the ground. A low, barely audible hiss escaped her lips, a sound that was pure warning. But she didn't run, and she didn't charge. She held her ground. She was letting this happen, extending a fragile, impossible thread of trust. With painstaking care, Jake reached in and gently lifted the first kitten. It was warm and trembling. He cradled it against his chest and stood up. Now came the longest walk of his life. The 50 yards across the open, snow-covered ground to the new shelter, in full view of the mother. He felt like he was walking on a wire over a canyon. He reached the small wooden shelter, knelt, and gently placed the kitten inside on the bed of familiar-smelling insulation. 3 more to go. He turned back. The walk to the wall was 100 lifetimes long. The wind whipped snow into his face, but he didn't blink. He could feel the mother bobcat stare like a physical weight. He knelt again, his movements fluid and practiced. He reached in, his gloved fingers finding another small, warm body. As he lifted the second kitten, the mother took a single, deliberate step out from behind the tree. She was no longer hiding. She was exposing herself, making her presence an undeniable fact. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. I am here. This is my child. Jake froze for a heartbeat. He held the kitten close, letting the mother see it was safe. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement from one parent to another. Then he turned and began the long walk back to the new shelter. This time, the silence felt different. It was charged with a terrifying understanding. He placed the second kitten next to its sibling and turned to repeat the process. 2 more trips. 2 more tests of this impossible pact. On the 3rd trip, a loose piece of sheet metal on the roof of the ruined building tore free in a gust of wind, crashing to the ground with a deafening clang. Jake flinched. The mother bobcat instantly dropped into a low crouch, her muscles coiled, a deep growl rumbling in her chest. For a terrifying second, the truce was broken. Jake stood perfectly still, the 3rd kitten held securely against his jacket. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe. He just waited, letting the echo of the crash fade into the howl of the wind. After an eternity, the bobcat relaxed her posture, inch by inch. The growl subsided. The trust, though badly shaken, was not shattered. He completed the 3rd trip, his own muscles screaming with tension. 1 kitten remained. As he walked back to the wall for the final time, he heard a new sound, faint but clear, carried on the wind from down the road, the low rumble of a heavy-duty truck engine. Henderson. They were out of time. Leo heard it too. He shot a panicked look at Jake. Dr. Sharma put a calming hand on Leo's arm, her eyes fixed on Jake. Her expression said it all. Finish it. Jake moved with renewed urgency, but did not hurry. He retrieved the last kitten, holding it for a moment, a tiny, precious weight in his hands. He stood and faced the tree line. He looked directly at the mother bobcat, held her gaze, and began his final walk. He placed the last kitten in the shelter. All 4 were now safe from the storm. But they were not yet safe from Henderson. Now we disappear, Dr. Sharma commanded in a low voice. Quickly, behind the excavator. Jake, Leo, and Anya backed away slowly, never turning their backs on the woods. They scrambled behind the cold yellow steel of the massive machine, peering through the gap between the track and the cab. The site was empty again. The human scent was fading. All that was left was the new wooden shelter, the falling snow, and the promise of warmth within, and the silent watcher in the trees. An agonizing minute passed, then another. The snow was falling heavily now, a thick white curtain descending upon the world. The kittens were invisible. The bobcat was invisible. Had they failed? Had she been too spooked by the noise, by their scent on her young? Jake felt a cold dread creep into his stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. Leo was fidgeting, his anxiety palpable. Maybe we should check. Quiet, Dr. Sharma whispered, her binoculars pressed to her eyes. Wait. And then she appeared. The bobcat emerged from the tree line like a wisp of smoke. She moved with a sublime, fluid grace, a predator in her element. She paused in the open, her head up, sniffing the snow-filled air. Her paws made no sound. She was a ghost gliding over the white ground. She circled the man-made shelter once, her nose low, reading the story of its creation from the scents left behind. She paused at the entrance, a moment of supreme hesitation. Then, with one final, sweeping look toward the hidden humans, she disappeared inside. The 3 of them held their breath. The silence stretched for an unbearable 10 seconds. 20. 30. Just as Jake started to believe she had rejected them, she backed out of the shelter, Clamped gently in her jaws was the first kitten. It dangled, limp and unafraid, completely trusting. Without a backward glance, she turned and trotted back toward the forest, vanishing into the trees as silently as she had appeared. Leo let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "She's doing it," he whispered, a grin of pure astonishment spreading across his face. "She's actually doing it." A few minutes later, the bobcat returned. She followed the same cautious path, retrieved the second kitten, and disappeared again. The process was methodical, efficient, and breathtakingly wild. It was a display of instinct and intelligence that left them all speechless. The rumble of the truck was much louder now. Headlights cut through the swirling snow at the far end of the access road. Henderson was here. Dr. Sharma looked at Jake. "She needs one more trip." The bobcat appeared for the third time, just as the headlights swept across the demolition site. She froze for a second, caught in the beam, her eyes glowing an eerie green. Then she ignored it, retrieved the third kitten, and melted back into the safety of the forest. The heavy-duty Ford F-350 skidded to a halt, its engine a low growl. The driver's side door flew open, and David Henderson stormed out. He wasn't dressed for the weather, his expensive polo shirt already damp, his face red with fury. Two other men, large and grim-faced, got out of the passenger side. "Riley!" Henderson bellowed, his voice cutting through the wind. "What is the meaning of this? I gave you a direct order. Where are the animals?" Jake, Leo, and Dr. Sharma stepped out from behind the excavator to face him. Jake stood his ground, his expression unreadable. He could see movement at the edge of his vision. From the tree line, the bobcat was emerging for her fourth and final trip. Henderson hadn't seen her yet. His rage was focused entirely on Jake. "I told you I would handle it, and I did," Jake said, his voice calm and even. "The situation is resolved." Henderson laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Resolved? Don't play games with me, Riley. My team is here to remove them. Now, are you going to step aside? Or am I going to have you removed too?" He took a threatening step forward. At that exact moment, the mother bobcat stepped into the open clearing, the last of her kittens held firmly in her mouth. She was directly in Henderson's line of sight. He stopped dead, his mouth falling open slightly. He stared at the wild cat, at the tiny kitten, and then at the makeshift shelter she had just left. He looked back at Jake, a flicker of disbelief and confusion in his eyes. The bobcat paid him no mind. She had a mission. She continued her silent, purposeful walk across the snow-covered ground, heading for the safety of the pines. For a long moment, everyone was frozen, watching the final act of the drama. The wild mother, her family now secure, was retreating from their world. Henderson slowly turned his head back to Jake, his anger momentarily replaced by sheer astonishment. The moment was broken by the crackle of a radio from one of Henderson's men. "Boss, we got a call. A reporter from the Arizona Daily Sun. Someone sent them a tip about a construction crew working to save a bobcat family from the storm. They want to comment." Leo flinched, trying to look innocent. Henderson's eyes narrowed, first at Leo, then at Dr. Sharma, and finally settled on Jake. He understood. He had been completely outmaneuvered. He was no longer a developer being delayed by a pest problem. He was now the potential villain in a heartwarming local news story. The choice was no longer his. He stood there in the falling snow, flanked by his hired muscle, staring at the empty shelter and the tracks leading into the forest. He looked at the defiant faces of Jake and his small team. The muscles in his jaw worked silently. He had lost. The question was, how would he react to being cornered so perfectly? He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and his face hardened into a mask of pure, cold fury. He pointed a finger at Jake. "You," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You're fired." The words hung in the frozen air, colder than the snow. "You're fired." For a moment, no one moved. Leo looked like he'd been struck. Jake's face, however, remained a stoic mask, though something had shifted in his eyes. The weariness was gone, replaced by a hard, quiet calm. He had made his choice, and he was ready for the consequences. Before he could respond, Dr. Sharma stepped forward, placing herself between Jake and the irate developer. She was not intimidated. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice even and professional, "you can certainly do that. But you might want to consider your options. The reporter from the Daily Sun is likely on their way here right now. They're expecting a story about a compassionate local company going the extra mile to protect wildlife." She paused, letting the words sink in. Imagine the headline you're about to give them instead. "Developer fires foreman for saving bobcat kittens from storm." In a town like Flagstaff, a story like that, well, it tends to stick. Henderson's face went from red to a pale, mottled white. He looked from Dr. Sharma's unblinking gaze to Jake's defiant stillness, and then to the tire tracks of his own truck, which had nearly run over the spot where the mother bobcat had just been. He was trapped. The story was no longer his to control. He had become a character in a narrative he didn't write, and he was about to be cast as the villain. His two men shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Even they knew a losing battle when they saw one. Henderson let out a string of curses under his breath, a venomous, frustrated sound. He stabbed a finger back toward Jake. "This isn't over, Riley. Get back to work. I want this site cleared and graded by the end of the week." He didn't wait for a reply. He spun around, stormed back to his truck, and slammed the door. The F-350 roared to life, spitting gravel and slush as it tore back down the access road, its red tail lights disappearing into the white curtain of the snowstorm. Silence descended again, thick and heavy. The only sound was the wind. Leo finally let out a long, shaky breath. He looked at Jake. He can't just do that, can he? Fire you and then unfire you? Jake watched the road where Henderson had vanished, a wry, tired smile finally touching his lips. He can do whatever he wants, but he just found out that sometimes it costs more than it's worth. He turned his gaze to Leo. "A reporter, huh?" Leo shuffled his feet, looking down at the snow. "Figured we needed some insurance. I sent an anonymous email an hour ago, with a picture of the kittens." Jake looked at the young man he dismissed as a lazy, phone-addicted kid. He saw something else now. He saw a quick-thinking ally who had used his own tools to save the day. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound, unspoken respect. "Good work, Garcia." Dr. Sharma was smiling. "My job here is done," she said. "The coalition will send a team to monitor the area for a few weeks, just to be sure. But I think she'll be fine. You did a good thing here today, both of you." She shook Jake's hand, then Leo's, and with a final look toward the quiet forest, she walked to her Subaru and drove away, leaving the two men alone on the silent, snow-covered site. The tension finally broke. Leo let out a whoop of laughter and relief. "Man, did you see his face?" But Jake wasn't listening. He was looking at the small, empty shelter, and the delicate tracks leading from it into the deep woods, already beginning to fade under the fresh layer of snow. He had faced down his boss, risked his livelihood, and brokered a truce with a predator. And for the first time in a long time, the familiar ache in his bones felt less like cynicism and more like pride. Later that night, the storm had fully enveloped the town. Snow piled up against the windows of Jake's small house. The site was shut down, buried under a foot of white. He sat in his worn armchair, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. He thought about the day. He thought about the yellow eyes watching him from the trees. He thought about the impossible weight of a kitten in his hands. He picked up his phone and dialed his son. Mark answered on the second ring, his voice wary. "Hey." "Hey," Jake said. He didn't know where to start. He didn't want to argue. He didn't want to justify himself. He just wanted to tell the story. "You know those kittens I told you about?" "Yeah." "She took them," Jake said, his voice quiet. "The mother. The storm was coming in, and Henderson was on his way. She wouldn't move, so I had to move them, one by one. I carried them over to a new shelter we built for her." He paused, remembering. And the whole time, she just watched me. She was right there. I could hear her growling. But she let me do it. She trusted me to carry her babies across that field. He stopped, not knowing what else to say. The line was silent for a long time. Jake thought Mark had hung up. "Mark? I'm here." His son's voice came back, different now. The cynicism was gone. It was replaced by something else. Awe. You actually did that?" "I did," Jake said. Another long pause. Then Mark spoke, and the words were the beginning of a bridge across a gulf that had been widening for years. "That's actually pretty incredible, Dad." A month later, the snow had melted and returned and melted again. The frame of the first luxury condo was already rising against the backdrop of the San Francisco peaks, a skeleton of fresh lumber and ambition. Jake Riley stood on the site, his Carhartt jacket zipped against the morning chill, directing a crane operator. Henderson had been true to his word, pushing the schedule relentlessly, but his calls were clipped and professional. He never mentioned the Bobcat again. The story in the Daily Sun had been a small sensation, painting the development in a surprisingly positive light. Leo was still on the crew, working with a new focus, a new sense of purpose. The two men didn't talk about that day, but the understanding was there, a silent pact of their own. As dusk began to settle, Jake told his crew to pack it in. He was the last to leave, as always. He got into his truck and started down the access road. But tonight, he stopped where the pavement met the edge of the Coconino National Forest. He cut the engine, letting the silence of the woods wash over him. He scanned the tree line, not really expecting to see anything. It had been weeks. She was long gone, deep in the territory she knew. But then, for just a fleeting second, he saw her, a flicker of movement at the edge of the deep shadows. She was standing there, a tawny shape against the dark pines, her tufted ears alert. She wasn't looking at the construction. She was looking at his truck. Their eyes met across the distance. There was no sentiment in her gaze, no human emotion. There was only the wild, untamable soul of the forest. It was a simple, silent acknowledgement of a pact that had been made, and a pact that had been kept. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she turned and vanished into the trees, leaving Jake alone with the hum of the cooling engine and the quiet dignity of the darkening peaks. Some boundaries are never meant to be crossed, but sometimes true understanding is found right at the edge. The question that remains is, When faced with an impossible choice, where do you draw the line? Was Jake right to risk his job and defy his boss to save the animals? Or is a person's first responsibility to their own livelihood?